Good morning or good afternoon for our East Coasters. This is Justin Jones, professional instructor here at Hard Dollar. We're excited for you to join us for our benchmarking webinar today, and I will be your presenter. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a little bit about Hard Dollar for those who aren't familiar. We are the industry leader in project cost management. Hard Dollar shines in three main areas. We do very detailed cost model estimating. We also do measuring of your project's performance on the project controls side, and we help you come up with a solid forecast of where you'll end up on your project. We also have key integration points with these other areas in design, scheduling, and also connecting up with your financials, so your ERP or accounting system, because there's some key information that is obviously influencing the cost of your project from those other areas. We bring all of this together into one platform, which we call Project Cost Management. So let me just set some expectations for today and what we'll be covering. The agenda is as follows. First, we'll talk about the purpose of benchmarking. Second, we'll take a look at the keys to successfully implementing a benchmarking strategy. Third, obstacles you may encounter, and we'll finish up with a scenario of what benchmarking might look like in an organization. So let's move forward. Just a little bit. This is a picture of the Sonoran Desert. We live in Arizona, and I really enjoy mountain biking. And the desert can be a beautiful place, especially with the sunsets. Usually when I'm out riding, I like to keep track of my speed and my time. And as I go along, I think I'm doing really well. I'm going fast, everything's clicking along, and then out of nowhere, another biker comes along and flies right by me. You know, suddenly in that moment, I have a new frame of reference for how I'm performing, and I feel a little bit more like this. So when we talk about benchmarking, what we're really doing is we're giving ourselves something to compare against. You may think you're doing great, or you may think you're doing horrible, but until you have some real information to go off, it's just guesswork. Like William Edwards Deming, the world-renowned business management consultant, once said, how do you know? You may feel confident in how you're doing, but how do you really know? So let's talk a little bit about benchmarking. It really came to the forefront in the late 1980s in the manufacturing industry. You may have heard of Robert C. Camp, maybe not, but he put out an essay about benchmarking called Benchmarking, the Search for Industry Best Practices That Lead to Superior Performance. It's been established as an important tool in the manufacturing and production industries, and more recently, benchmarking has moved into the construction industry as a best practice. There are two major types of benchmarking being utilized. The first is internal, and that's used to measure how things are going inside the organization. You also have external, which is kind of the one I gave an example of when you're comparing to the competition. Now, the Construction Industry Institute for Benchmarking and Metrics, they were created in 1993, and their goal was to provide the industry with a common set of metrics and provide performance norms and then later they did a core set of indicators right about the year 2000. What that is, participants fill out a questionnaire online and make web-based updates during the duration of the project. And then, as of 2004, the CII benchmarking database had over 1,200 projects representing $60 billion in costs. So it became a resource for comparative measurement. For our purposes today, we'll be more focused on the internal benchmarking, so measurement and comparison of your own internal performance. So let's just take a look through here. As we get started, let's assume you're at the starting point of implementing benchmarking in your organization. So there are a few keys to successfully creating an internal benchmarking process, and I want you to think about what would you need to do in order to be successful. So keys to success. First of all, having company buy-in. This needs to be at all levels of the organization. Otherwise, it'll be a real challenge to get out of the starting blocks. Second, access to the right information. So how can we get the right people to the right information in the easiest way possible? And then also looking at consistent, standardized process. Having some sort of a process in place to be able to collect that information and have it organized in a way that people can make sense of it and be able to make improvements for the current project that you may be working on. So where do we start? Well, buy-in starts at the top. Executives need to be able to see the value. So they're going to be asking themselves questions such as, well, how will this help me meet my business objectives? So if you think about it from that level, really it's about being profitable, and perhaps there's some issues with staying within budget on projects. So if they can see that benchmarking can help them save money and be more accurate with estimates, they'll be more inclined to buy in. Top-down initiatives, really, they're going to fail when the rubber hits the road unless a department-level champion picks it up and runs with it. Even with buy-in at the top, it usually takes a lot to get a big initiative like this off the ground. So there's a need for an enthusiastic sponsor. Commitment is also key. Commitment of resources, man-hours, etc. So if we're going to do it, let's go all in. This requires a lot of setup and resources at all levels. The payoff, however, can be great, but does come at a little bit of a cost. Benchmarking can give you confidence based on the data from past performance. So in review, we want to make sure that buy-in, where does that begin? Executive buy-in, department level champions, and then lastly that we have commitment of the resources necessary to take this to the next level. So when we are thinking about access to the right information, where can you actually go to get access to that information? Think about your project history. How are you recording your actual performance and costs today? And then how do you get to that information? That can feel pretty daunting. So the first thing is to establish a data repository of that information, and a best practice is to get in that information into a database. Once the data is in a computer system, you're going to have a much easier time doing searches and filters to get that information easily. Also, solid record keeping. If you have a bunch of information in there and it's all garbage, well, garbage in, garbage out. For example, if you're doing a lot of piping work and no one can find the right sizes and types of pipe spools or the flanges and the other fittings needed, then no one's really going to use it. So how is that information going to be input, and who's going to do it? And also, how will people get that information? Those are questions that you'll want to ask yourselves as you're starting out. Now, what are you measuring, or what to measure? What we need is commonly accepted effective metrics for assessing project performance. So what might be some examples of that? Well, production, your man-hours per unit, or the converse, your unit per man-hour. Costs, equipment, materials, all of these are things that you could take a look at. However, I want you to be aware that production is often a better indicator to use than costs, because as you think about costs, they generally escalate and change over time. And remember, the farther back you go in history, the less reliable those costs become. So thinking about labor, you might actually think about production or things like that. And then there's some other information. So as you think about what other information besides productivity and costs, let's think about this. And so I've put up this scenario. Say you were this skier. Context is really key here. For example, well, where are you skiing? And as you're seeing this, you know, obviously this looks like maybe Switzerland, nice and beautiful day. But what if the context were a little bit different? So think about this. You're probably not going to have as much success skiing in the Sahara Desert. In fact, you probably die of heat stroke before too long. So when evaluating productivity information, you need to know the context around it in order to better understand how did they come up, or how did we come up with that number. So let's take a look at some things. First of all, you want to know about accessibility. In Switzerland in the mountains versus Sahara Desert, or whether you're working in town or you're working at a remote location, those kind of things are going to be determine what kind of access you have for your equipment, etc. Also, what are the weather conditions when you're doing the project? That can have a big effect. The seasons or the time of year and what months. Also, your location and the geography. How challenging can that be? Another one are conditions. So think about unique conditions like soil conditions when you are working and how that changes from location to location. Again, this information you may want to store for activities in your project database so that as you are looking at your benchmarking information, you have the context around it. Okay, so when we are talking about estimating, say, I'm going to give you a little example. Say we're estimating a new bridge project and we want to look at benchmarking data from similar projects in the past. So I'm going to review a couple of past projects, and I notice costs and productivity are significantly different from one to another. So why would that be? Well, I need some context. So let me show you. First of all, this is job number 1 from a previous project, and this is, a box girder bridge over a roadway. The production I noticed on this one is significantly better than the historic bridge project that I look at. So this is the second bridge, and it's over a river canyon. Now this one, the productivity is much higher and the cost much lower than the first bridge. So I want to analyze the context to find out why and what would affect the productivity. So clearly, as we look at this, accessibility is playing a big role here. The first bridge is close to the city, so it's easy to mobilize all the equipment and manpower to get to it. The second bridge is in the middle of nowhere, and it's 100 feet higher, which creates some challenges, not to mention that it's spanning a river gorge. So let's just look at one of the activities. The concrete pouring activities are also going to be higher productivity because the pumper can access the bridge on the girder from both sides, pouring directly to the bridge, whereas the canyon bridge, the pumper could only access from one side. There had to be 100 feet of hose to get clear across the existing deck to pour, and the construction crew had to handle all of that. Therefore, you've got more manpower, less productive, and it takes longer to get it done. Next, let's take a look at soil conditions. Well, even from these representations, you can see that the soil conditions were going to be very different. The canyon walls were harder rock to pile into, requiring heavy-duty 10 by 24H with a 10-inch flange pile, so greater material expense. So other things that could have affected this were the weather. One, you're in a more mild climate, and then with this one spanning the gorge, you've got weather conditions, you've got wind, colder temps, all affecting the way that the productivity happens on the job. So all of these factors play into that time it takes to complete, and thereby are going to affect the cost as well. So let's take a look at being successful. In order to be successful in benchmarking, should be implemented as a structured, systematic process, and it has to become an integral part of your organization, just like the measurements used to track your project progress. It'll not be successful if applied kind of in an ad hoc fashion on a random basis. So here, we have some random points, kind of hit and miss. In most cases, benchmarking is best practice oriented and is part of a continuous improvement program that incorporates a feedback process. So benchmarking requires an understanding of what's important to the organization, sometimes called critical success factors, and then measuring performance for these factors. So you need more than just a few random data points. It needs to be consistently tracked on your project so that you can get beyond just 3 benchmarking data points. So here's an example. Now we have numerous data points from which to draw information. The more project information you're able to track will pay big dividends later by giving you a better point of view. So what it requires is a repeatable, structured, and systematic collection of the data. And then finally, you can get a real big picture where you can see how all of those different points make up the whole portrait. So again, repeatable, structured, systematic, giving you a full picture view. One of the most critical parts of the benchmarking process is developing a good collection methodology. How are you going to track and compare? So let's take a look at this. Cost-effective value-added benchmarking can be implemented through standardization of definitions and application of computer-based technologies. There needs to be a common denominator to benchmark effectively. So when you think of a slot machine, when you get 3 common denominators, boom, you win. The same goes for benchmarking. When you find a common code which you can track off from one project to another, then you're going to be able to get the information you're really looking for. So let me kind of give you an example of this. I've got some piling work to do, so I'm going to compare piling work from my previous projects. Okay? To just say, though, that I'm going to look at piling is probably too broad of a definition. To make a valid comparison, I need to take into account that there are different types of piling and different flange sizes. So there could be a lot of variance from project to project. So I would get more specific in my comparison, and I would look at wood piling versus steel piling and measure the productivity and costs on both of them. I could also break it down further by looking at the different sizes that give me a much better idea. I could also use coding to help in the identification. It's really up to you and your organization to determine how detailed you want to look at your information. However, you'll want to seek the right balance. Just remember, don't go too broad, and keep in mind that the more detailed you get, then the more time it may take. You'll also need to decide how are you going to measure things when comparing, or what are your parameters? What do you feel comfortable with? So how far does a project need to go or be off track to be considered way off in your organization? So what is considered a red flag to you? And so on this, example here, well, we've defined that as, is 5 to 10%, is that way off? Or maybe more than 10% would be way off, and we'll say 5 to 10% is a little off. So that would be our yellow flag. And then in the green, that would be anything that had a variance from 0 to 5%. So once you've collected all the data, the big benefit is being able to compare and analyze that information. This is where all of your hard work in setup really pays off. So when comparing performance, you need to prioritize. Typically, the items with the most costs and the most man-hours are going to carry the most risk for that project. So a best practice would be to focus on those items first and look for your red flags. So benchmarking processes are not necessarily easy to implement, and to be successful, an organization must overcome numerous barriers. Some private sector companies, they fear that they may lose their competitive advantage by sharing information, and others fear exposure of organizational weakness. Use of an identity blind process whereby data are posted without attribution can mitigate these concerns. For some organizations, arrogance is a major obstacle. These organizations may believe that they're the best, so why benchmark? In other organizations, they're unaware of the value of benchmarking and believe that benchmarking systems don't adequately address their needs. So benchmarking agreements and training increase familiarity with these benchmarking processes and can help to reduce these barriers. One of the greatest barriers to benchmarking is a lack of resources. Most organizations are leaner today than in the past, and dedicating the essential resources can be difficult. For some organizations, project processes and computer systems are not sufficiently developed to easily support benchmarking. For these organizations, the benchmarking process will require more manual intervention and consequently greater resources. As the project processes become automated, this barrier should really shrink. So now I'd like to walk you through a small example of a company that is starting out with benchmarking. So here's Steve, and he's the chief estimator for XYZ Construction. And his team creates cost estimates and submits bid proposals to a variety of clients. While the prospects themselves can vary in nature, the actual nature of the work activities performed between these projects is somewhat uniform. So Steve challenges his team of estimators to be able to justify their assumptions in each current estimate. He wants to know if similar work has been performed at a similar rate in the past, and if not, why not? So to get started, first they figure out what key performance indicators that they want to benchmark. Okay? Next, they define the matching criteria for like items. Within XYZ, standard account codes have been used company-wide for several years. So XYZ uses HD's account code field as the matching criteria between past projects and the present ones. And benchmarking can still be performed without codes, I want you to be aware, and HD allows for any combination of cost item attributes, including tags, for example, description, cost breakdown structure code, and user-defined fields to be defined as the matching criteria. During the estimating phase of a project, Steve and his team determine the best historic projects that should be used as a basis of comparison with current projects. This criteria can be different for each type of project estimated by the company. For instance, on a large earthwork project, Steve will typically want to use projects in the same geographic area for comparison. Since local soil conditions greatly impact performance and cost on these types of projects. For industrial projects, however, Steve is more concerned with past projects that were performed with union versus non-union labor. For example, if the estimate being put together requires union labor, Steve doesn't want any non-union projects used as a basis for comparison, as XYZ's experience has told them that union projects are more costly than non-union projects and typically perform at slower rates of productivity. So, defining the variance for themselves. During the bid review meetings, Steve doesn't have the time nor the energy to review each cost item in detail in the CBS. Instead, he wants to be flagged or alerted to the items that fall outside of the predetermined comfort range. For Steve, a red flag occurs when an estimated value is greater than 10% from its historic average. In other words, any cost production rate that is more than 10% higher or lower than the past performance will be coded with a red flag. The yellow is going to be anything between 5 and 10%. And then, like I said before, between 0 and 5%, that one gets a green flag. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to show you just how that works in HD. So let me go ahead and bring in our hard dollar product here. And what I would do is I would go here to Forms and our job properties, and right over here to benchmarking. And then this is where I'm going to be able to look at all of those settings for benchmarking and create those properties for our benchmarking. Now, as you look here, we've got the historical data source, and I have two different options. I can look at my as estimated, or I can look at my as built. Well, when you think about this, you probably want to look at your as built so that you have more historical data to go from. So just a thought there. Then the default matching criteria, what I talked about, all of those areas that you can look at in order to create your matches, that's what you would do there. And then also your default job filters, which jobs do you want to look at? This is where you would control how many of those you would like to take a look at. Then you have your x-axis and your y-axis, and you have options as to what it is that you want to look at. For our purposes today, we'll look at quantity versus units per man-hour. You can look at your average as a weighted average or just regular. And then today we're going to benchmark with the cost per unit and the units per man-hour. Also, this is where you can set your own variance. So we were using the 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 and beyond. You can go ahead and set that for yourselves. So what I want to show you now is once we've set that up, we would go ahead and hit OK. And then we can come into our cost breakdown structure, and you can see very quickly where we're looking at this and how that's shaping up. So just here on cost item 5, you've got on your current estimate $30.84. You've got your benchmark cost at $29.98, and so you see you're in the green because your variance is a positive 2.87%. Here also, your unit per man hour, on this one you're at 16.83, and on the average you are at 16.80. So kind of cool to be able to see that at a quick glance when you're going into a meeting. I want to just show you quickly our cost item 4.3.1. And here on the right-hand side, we have our benchmarking tab. And no, this isn't a flag from some country that you don't recognize. It's really taking that benchmarking. You have your white diamond here, and as you hover over that, you're going to see that this is your current. The current estimate, the orange is actually going to be the average. And then you have the prisms here, or the triangles, and those are going to be the previous projects that you are benchmarking against. So again, as you look at this, the average line, you've got your green, your yellow variance, and then also your red. So we have a couple of outliers here. Just taking a look at this as I hover over, I can see that my units per man hour are at 37.5 on this one, and I'm looking at this job, and on that one they were at 62 or 63, 62.5. That's quite a big difference. So that's where I would want to look at those functions, just like with the skier. What else is going on here? What are some of the factors that are affecting that? And then also I have these three, and as I'm looking at those, they really are much more closely related, maybe in the unit per man hour size, or units per man hour, excuse me. So with that, I also want to show you, I'm going to go ahead and go back to the slide deck here and show you also using HD Project Intelligence, our reporting tool for that. You can benchmark multiple projects and easily see higher and lower costs, for example, and see at the same time the location. So as we're looking at this one, this is different locations of your projects, and then the bigger the circle, the larger the project. And so you can see where those are at on a more enterprise level for you, providing more context and more insight. So as we looked at today, we talked about the purpose of benchmarking, why we would want to do that. We have our benchmarking keys to success, overcoming some of those obstacles as an organization, and just a small little scenario to kind of get your minds thinking about how that might work. So I appreciate all of you listening in. I'd like to open it up to question and answer, and we also have Paul Binion here to help you out with that. So let's open it up to questions.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. This is Paul Binion, the Director of Training at Hard Dollar. If you have a question, we just ask you to go ahead and use the chat function on the GoToMeeting. You should see it there on the right-hand panel. Go ahead and just type in any questions that you may have. And it looks like we have a question that's come up. And it is, if you don't happen to have benchmarking history, should you enter past project information manually? And we have encountered that with some of our clients where they had recently purchased Hard Dollar as their estimating tool, so they didn't have a lot of historic data already set up in there, of course. And so we worked with them as part of the implementation process and made some recommendations on some key projects that they would want to use as kind of milestone projects. And they picked the ones that would be best representations, that would have the most reusable items that they would be bidding again in the future, so that they would be able to compare against those. And we provide functionality that allows them to be able to import that project information into Hard Dollar. And in doing that, they were able to have a nice benchmark to go against. The downside of trying to get data entered in there that isn't already captured in the system is just the amount of time it takes to be able to pull that information in and go through it and analyze it and make sure it's accurate. It can take quite a bit of time. But for that reason, it wouldn't be bringing in dozens of projects, but the key projects that would best be used as examples. Okay, we have another question. How long it takes a company to build their own benchmarking database? And that kind of plays to what we were just talking about. And that's really going to depend on the number of projects that typically are being constructed by your organization. And of course, that is going to vary. What you really want to come up with is, like we mentioned before, the more data points that you have, the more reliable your benchmarking information is going to be. You're going to be able to play smarter with the more information that you have. So it's going to depend if within a 6-month time frame you have a dozen projects that are similar in nature that have been at the very least estimated. Hopefully a number of those have been awarded and you've actually done the work and have as-built or actuals data that you're able to capture. Being able to compare against those. Really, you want to have at least 3 other projects that you can compare against to be able to start making any decisions off of that. And those 3 projects, you want them to be within that same context like we were talking about, with similar conditions, similar enough that you can draw conclusions from them. Okay, we have another question. RS Means is brought up as a good third-party tool for getting some standard benchmarking kind of information, but it's pointed out that it doesn't cover some of the specialized sectors, and the question has been risen, are there any other choices when it comes to third-party databases? And there are certainly a number out there. Hard Dollar actually incorporates a second third-party database that can be purchased as a module, which is Richardson data, which is more along the industrial side, the specialty of mechanical piping and such. And of course, there's other ones out there that can be incorporated into Hard Dollar as an estimating tool, or I'm sure into whatever system you are using for your estimating. Along with that, a lot of our industrial clients use norms data, which is basically their own internal set of benchmarking kind of information, as we've been discussing, that they incorporate in. Okay, and another question, are there any pre-established benchmarking resources in Hard Dollar? Hard Dollar does not have its own set of data. As mentioned, we do use those third-party tools of RS Means and Richardson's for that kind of information. But we do have an interface pre-built that allows you to be able to, if you already have a data set of that information and it happens to be in SQL or Access as the database, we can actually connect right up to that, so you can be off to the races within a couple of days. Okay, another question. Do you consider inflation and economic conditions when benchmarking, and how do you do that on HD? Okay, great question. So as we mentioned, over time, costs can really fluctuate, and that is definitely a factor that you want to be taking into consideration. You do have ways to tag your activities and also apply factors to your activities to take into consideration other conditions such as weather, season, and so forth, so that you can, as you're looking at the benchmarking information, you can call out those differences. Okay, and another question. You were talking about those CI benchmarks. I think that's standing for cost item. Do these benchmarks come with enough information to describe the context? This is a great question. That actually is something that we have in the works. We would like to provide even more context, being able to attach photos and other information to capture as much of that information as the projects are being done. In its current state, as mentioned, we do have factors and tags, which are labels that can be used to call out that information. Okay, and just reading through, looks like we have another question here. Asking for an example of how Hard Dollar works in terms of benchmarking for different workmanship efficiencies for construction of mixed-use development projects. Looks like this is one that we may need to take offline. So if we could, whoever submitted that question, we will have the ability for you to submit an email over to us if you wouldn't mind, or so that we can have your contact information, and I'd be happy to walk through a more specific scenario offline with you. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for all of your questions. And just to wrap up for today's webinar, the next steps, we have just a few steps for you to allow you to be able to get your CEU credit and to get that certificate out to you. We will be emailing each of you a link with that quiz that you'll be able to complete. Once completed, we will send out the certificate via email within 3 to 5 business days. So thank you, all of you, for attending our benchmarking introductory course. Again, if you have any questions whatsoever, go ahead and send us an email at training@harddollar.com. If there was anything that you didn't happen to get answered and would like it answered for you, we'd be happy